Hey there, survivors. Thanks for tuning in to tonight's episode. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. It really helps me keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now let's get started. I have been underground for 60 days now, but the sense of time has completely unraveled. There are no sunrises here, no sunsets, only the constant hum of the air recirculation units and the low vibration of the pumps buried even deeper below my feet. I count the days with scratches on the concrete near my bunk, but even those marks feel meaningless. I don't know if the world above is still burning, or if it's simply empty. Part of me isn't sure I even want to find out. This place was never meant to be a home. It's a Cold War relic, a missile silo buried 150 feet below the windswept plains. When I bought it 5 years ago, people thought I was paranoid. Maybe they weren't wrong, but I was prepared. I spent every dime I had reinforcing the structure, restoring power, sealing the blast doors, and filling it with enough food and water to last at least a year. I believed the world was fragile, that one crisis could unravel everything. It turned out I was right, though I never imagined the disaster would come in the form of the infected. It started quietly enough. News stories about a virus spreading across cities, people collapsing in the streets, emergency quarantines. Then came reports of attacks, violent outbreaks in hospitals, police overwhelmed. It escalated with terrifying speed. By the time I heard the first emergency alert on the radio, telling people to shelter in place, I was already down here, pulling the massive steel doors shut. That decision likely saved my life. The first nights were unbearable. I could still hear the outside world falling apart. Screams carried on the wind, the crack of gunfire echoing across the empty plains, engines roaring on the highway above as people fled in every direction. One night, someone pounded on the blast door, begging to be let in. Their voice was raw and desperate, and I stood there frozen on the other side of 6 inches of steel, rifle in hand, unable to do anything but listen. I didn't open the door. I told myself there was no way to know if the person was infected, but the truth was, I couldn't risk everything for a stranger. The pounding eventually stopped. Then came the silence. It's strange how quickly you notice the absence of sound. Up there, the world had been filled with motion and noise. Down here, the only things I hear now are mechanical. The generator humming through the concrete walls, the faint hiss of the air ducts, the occasional rattle of loose bolts when the ventilation fans kick on. I walk the corridors in silence, flashlight in hand, even though the fluorescent lights still work. I don't trust anything to last forever. I live mostly in what used to be the control center, a cramped cluster of rooms with peeling paint and steel doors. The old missile chamber beneath me is now storage, stacked with barrels of water and shelves of freeze-dried food, ammunition, tools, and medical supplies. It's a fortress of sorts, but even a fortress can become a tomb. Every day, I cycle through the same routine. Check the systems, ration the food, monitor the cameras. Most of the security cameras near the surface no longer work. Maybe they've been damaged by weather, or maybe someone destroyed them. All I see on those screens now is static. Last night, for the first time in weeks, I heard something on the surface. It wasn't loud, more like a faint vibration that carried down through the concrete, a dragging sound across the slab above the blast door. I stopped in my tracks the moment I noticed it. The hum of the generator faded into the background as I tried to isolate the noise. It came again a moment later, deliberate and slow, like something or someone was feeling its way around the sealed entrance. I shut off the lights in the control room and stood in darkness, listening. My mind was spinning with possibilities. Was it an infected? I've heard rumors about how they wander endlessly, sometimes drawn by sound, other times by nothing at all. Or could it have been a survivor, someone stumbling across the silo by chance? Worse still, I wondered if something out there had learned to follow the vibrations of the pumps and generators below. The noise lasted 10 minutes, maybe 15, though it felt like hours. It never turned into pounding or scratching, just that low dragging sound, circling the blast door as if testing it. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. I waited in the dark long after the sound was gone, afraid even to shift my weight for fear that something would hear me. I didn't sleep after that. This morning, if you can even call it morning when there's no sun, I checked the surface using the old mechanical periscope. The lens is cracked and fogged with age, but I could make out the empty plains above. Nothing moved. Not even the wind seemed to stir the tall grass. If something had been out there last night, it was gone now. But I can't shake the feeling I'm no longer alone. My supplies are holding out, though I've been rationing more strictly. Food isn't the problem, not yet. Water is trickier. The silo draws from an underground aquifer, filtered through a system I've kept running with spare parts. But the pumps are old. I know they won't last forever. A few days ago, one of the filters ruptured and contaminated the holding tank. I had to drain the entire system and start again, losing most of my reserves in the process. That single failure has left me more vulnerable than I like to admit. If the pump system fails completely, I'll be forced to surface and collect water by hand, which would mean exposing myself to whatever is out there. I keep telling myself I can fix anything that breaks, but I know that's not true. There are limits to what I can improvise. My generator fuel is another ticking clock. I run it only when necessary, but the gauge creeps lower every time I check it. I've built backup systems, battery banks, manual pumps, hand-cranked ventilation, but those are temporary solutions at best. I've started carrying my rifle slung tight across my chest even inside the silo. It isn't just the infected I worry about. If there are survivors left, some of them will be desperate enough to kill for food, fuel, or shelter. That's how the world works now. You trust no one. You show mercy only if you can afford it, and I can't afford it. I keep walking the corridors, running my hand along the cold concrete, listening for any sound that doesn't belong. The silence here feels different now, heavier, as if the world outside is holding its breath. 2 nights ago the sound came back. This time, it was louder, not just dragging, but scraping, something hard raking across the steel of the blast door. It went on for nearly 20 minutes, pausing occasionally before starting again. I sat in the control room, staring at the sealed entrance through the interior cameras, but the screens showed nothing but black and static. I held my rifle ready, trying not to move, barely daring to breathe. And then, as before, it stopped. I stayed awake for hours, listening for it to return, but the only sound was the soft hum of the generator. This morning, when I checked the blast door, I found something I hadn't noticed before. Tiny flecks of rust scattered across the floor. They weren't there yesterday. Something is wearing down the frame, slowly but steadily. I ran my fingers along the edge and felt shallow grooves scratched into the metal, deep enough to catch my fingernail. I don't know how much longer the door can hold. Now I'm faced with a choice I've been dreading. I can stay down here and hope the door keeps holding, or I can risk surfacing while I still have the chance. Maybe find other survivors, or at least another source of safety, before I'm trapped underground for good. The decision weighs on me constantly. I have enough food to last months, but food won't save me if the ventilation system fails, or if something breaches the silo. I keep looking at the ladder that leads up to the surface hatch, untouched since the day I sealed it. That hatch is a one-way gamble. If I go up there, I might not make it back down, but staying here might be worse. I've started to notice things I never used to think about, little details that could mean everything in a place like this. The air has been tasting slightly metallic the last 2 days, and I can't tell if that's my imagination or the ventilation system slowly failing. The filters have been running non-stop since I came down here. I swapped out the last set a week ago, and I only have 2 spares left. If the fans go, I can hand crank the system manually, but I won't be able to run it that way for long. Even with the silo's size, the air would get stale in a matter of days. I tried distracting myself with work. I spent half the morning reinforcing the interior doors, replacing hinges, double-checking the bar locks. I even rewired a few of the old motion sensors in the launch chamber, rigging them to buzz an alarm if anything manages to slip inside. It was a pointless exercise, really. If something breaches the blast door, none of that will matter. But it gave me something to focus on, something that felt productive. When I finished, I climbed the ladder to the upper platform and checked the blast door again. The rust flecks are still there, more of them now, like a fine dust on the concrete. I brushed them away and felt along the steel with my fingertips. The grooves have deepened. I can fit the edge of a screwdriver into one now. I stood there for a long time, with my ear pressed against the cold metal, listening. Nothing. No dragging. No scraping. Just the faint hum of the generator far below. But the silence doesn't reassure me anymore. At night, if I can still call it night, I've started hearing things in the lower levels. It's hard to tell what's real and what's my imagination. The silo is huge, with shafts and crawl spaces that haven't been used in decades, and sound carries strangely through concrete. Once, I heard a distant clanging, as if a metal pipe had been knocked loose far below in the missile chamber. Another time, there was a faint tapping that seemed to come from the maintenance tunnel behind the water system. I grabbed my rifle and checked both times. Nothing, but I'm beginning to feel like the silo isn't empty anymore. Yesterday, I took a light and crawled the length of the maintenance tunnel to be sure. It's a narrow shaft barely wide enough for me to fit through, the air thick with dust, my knees scraping against the rusted grates as I inched along. Every sound was amplified. The creak of old metal, the hiss of air through the ventilation ducts, my own breath echoing off the walls. I kept expecting to see something waiting at the far end, a shape crouched in the dark. But the tunnel was empty, as it always is. Still, I couldn't shake the sense of being watched as I backed out of that confined space. I'm starting to think the sounds I hear aren't coming from outside. Maybe something got in. I don't know how that would even be possible. The blast door is the only real entrance, and it's still sealed, but the feeling is there. I find myself checking rooms twice, opening doors slowly, scanning corners I know are empty. I've even started locking myself into the control center at night, which is ridiculous because there's no one else down here. At least there shouldn't be. The worst part is how easy it would be to lose track of reality down here. With no windows and no connection to the outside world, I'm living in a box with only my thoughts for company. When the lights are off and the generator cycles down to its low hum, the darkness is absolute. I can't even see my hand in front of my face. I catch myself imagining things in that darkness. The sound of shuffling feet, the glint of eyes watching from the end of a hallway. I know I'm just wearing myself down, but knowing it doesn't help. I spent today testing the backup systems. The hand-cranked ventilation still works, but it's exhausting. The battery banks are functional, but they'll only power the essentials for a week at best. I keep thinking about what it would be like to stay here until those systems fail completely. No fresh air, no power, just me sitting in the dark, waiting for the silence to finally consume me. That thought alone makes me consider opening the hatch, even if I don't know what's waiting above. Tonight I'll sleep in the control room again. I set up the cot near the bank of monitors, rifle leaning against the wall within arm's reach. I don't know why the cameras at the surface stopped working, but I keep the screens on anyway, staring at the static. It's better than staring at nothing. Around midnight, just as I was dozing off, I heard it again, the scraping at the blast door. Louder this time, deliberate. I sat up slowly, rifle in hand, trying not to make a sound. The noise didn't stop. It came in slow bursts, scrape, pause, scrape, like claws working patiently at the steel. I stepped over to the ladder and climbed halfway up, crouching near the hatch with my ear pressed against the door. The vibrations came through clearly. Whatever was on the other side was strong enough to gouge steel. I thought about shouting, trying to scare it off. But what if it wasn't alone? What if my voice only drew more of them? The scraping continued for nearly 30 minutes, and then there was a new sound. Something struck the door, a heavy thud that reverberated down through the entire silo. Then, another. I backed down the ladder slowly, forcing myself not to bolt for the control room. I stood in the middle of the silo floor, listening to the rhythmic pounding. Each impact was strong enough to make dust rain from the ceiling seams. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the pounding stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I stood there for a long time, gripping the rifle so tightly, my knuckles ached, ears straining for any sign that it was still there. But there was nothing. I barely slept after that. I kept imagining the grooves on the blast door deepening with each scrape, the hinges straining with each blow, If it breaks through, there's nowhere for me to run. This morning, I checked the door again. More rust dust on the floor, more grooves in the steel. Whatever is out there isn't giving up. It's testing the door, wearing it down. I don't know how long it will take, but I know it's only a matter of time. I've started packing a go bag. Nothing heavy, just what I can carry if I have to climb out and run. Canteens, food rations, ammunition, tools, a length of rope, a small first aid kit. I keep going back and forth on whether I should bring the radio. It's bulky and burns through batteries, but if I found other survivors... No, that's wishful thinking. I haven't heard a single transmission since the first week. I'm not ready to surface yet. I need more time to think, more time to prepare. But I can't ignore the reality. The longer I stay, the worse my odds become. If something breaches that door, I won't even have a chance. I walked the entire silo again today, checking the perimeter as if I could find a weakness I'd missed before. The launch chamber was still silent, the catwalks lined with dust. I paused at the far end of the room, staring up at the narrow access shaft that leads to the surface hatch. It felt different today, standing there in the dim light. That hatch is my only way out, but it might also be a death sentence. I turned away eventually, forcing myself to keep busy, to go through the usual checks of the generator room and the water system. I was halfway through flushing the filters when I heard it, a sharp metallic crack that echoed through the concrete walls. It came from above, somewhere near the blast door. My first thought was that the door had given way, but the noise didn't repeat. I set my tools down quietly and picked up the rifle leaning against the wall. I climbed the stairs 2 at a time, my boots scraping against the metal treads, ears straining for another sound. At the top platform I froze, crouching low by the ladder that leads up to the door. I didn't hear anything at first, just the distant hum of the generator and the blood rushing in my ears. Then came the scraping. It wasn't frantic, it was measured, steady, like something dragging hard metal against steel. I leaned forward until my ear was almost touching the underside of the blast door. The sound came in pulses. Grind, pause, grind, always in the same spot near the edge of the frame. I pictured claws at first, but that didn't make sense. The sound was too harsh, too clean. It was more like a tool, something with weight behind it, gouging into the metal. I backed down a few steps, gripping the rifle tighter as I thought it through. If it was one of the infected, it shouldn't be using tools. They just hammer or throw themselves at obstacles mindlessly. But if it was a person... I climbed back up to the small observation slit, a gap barely the width of my finger, hidden in the frame of the hatch. I angled my eye against it and saw movement outside. At first I thought it was just wind rustling the grass, but then a shape shifted into view. Someone was crouched at the base of the door, shoulders hunched, arm moving in slow, deliberate motions. I couldn't make out details in the dim light, only the gleam of something metallic in their hand. I wanted to shout, to demand they stop, but I bit it back. If there was one person out there, there could be more, and I couldn't give away my exact position. I watched in silence as the figure worked at the door for a few more minutes before pausing. They looked up suddenly, as if they'd heard something behind them, then backed away into the shadows beyond my line of sight. I waited another 10 minutes, then 20, eyes glued to the slit, but the figure didn't return. My chest felt tight from holding my breath. Whoever it was hadn't been infected. The movements were too coordinated, the posture too steady. That left me with only one conclusion. Someone was trying to force their way inside. I retreated down the ladder and locked myself into the control room, pacing the narrow space. I kept replaying the sound in my head, the deliberate scrape of metal on metal. If they'd been using a tool, they might have already weakened the door. I couldn't wait this out anymore. If the door failed while I was trapped inside, there would be nowhere to run. I decided I would have to go outside and confront whatever was happening. I didn't like the idea, but it was better than being sealed in here like an animal. I pulled my go bag from the corner and went through the contents one last time. 2 canteens, rations for 3 days, spare magazines, a length of rope, flashlight, multi-tool, and a small pry bar. I slung the rifle across my back and clipped the pistol to my belt. I stood at the base of the ladder for a long time, staring up at the hatch, trying to work up the nerve. The thought of opening that door after 60 days underground felt like stepping off a cliff. I climbed slowly, one rung at a time, until I was pressed against the steel. I unlocked the first set of hydraulic latches, the mechanism groaning in protest after weeks of inactivity. I disengaged the second latch and braced my shoulder against the hatch. The seal broke with a hiss of stale air. Cold wind rushed down into the silo, carrying the smell of dirt and old grass. I climbed up, eased the hatch open a few inches, and scanned the horizon with the rifle raised. The plains were empty. I stepped fully outside, boots crunching on the dry earth, and turned in a slow circle. The silo was hidden beneath a shallow rise in the ground, and the surrounding grassland stretched for miles without a single tree to break the view. There was no sign of movement, no sound but the wind. I waited a full minute before lowering the rifle. I examined the outside of the blast door next. The steel was gouged deeply near the edge, the grooves raw and shiny, fresh enough that flakes of metal still clung to the frame. Whatever tool had been used left clean, parallel marks, the kind you'd expect from a pry bar or a heavy chisel. Whoever had done this knew exactly where to attack. I crouched low and studied the ground around the entrance. The soil was hard-packed, but I could still see faint impressions where someone had knelt, boot prints leading away into the grass. They weren't recent enough to be crisp, already softened by the wind, but they gave me a direction. The tracks led toward the old access road half a mile away. I debated following them, but the open land offered no cover. If I ran into whoever had been here, I'd have no advantage at all. Instead, I circled the rise slowly, checking for any other sign of intrusion. On the far side, I found a discarded length of steel pipe, its end flattened and scarred from striking the door. I carried the pipe back to the hatch and stood there thinking. Someone had found this place, and they might return with better tools or with help. If I retreated underground and sealed the door again, I could be trapping myself. But if I stayed out here, exposed, I'd be just as vulnerable. I forced myself to move quickly. I returned to the hatch and climbed halfway down the ladder, pausing to listen. The interior of the silo was silent, the same oppressive silence I'd been living with for weeks. I dropped the bag inside, then climbed back up and closed the hatch enough to leave a narrow gap. From this vantage point, I could watch the approach from a distance while still being able to retreat if necessary. I waited there for hours, crouched on the edge of the hatch with the rifle resting on the lip, eyes scanning the horizon. The sun was already low when I finally saw movement in the distance. A figure crossing the access road. They moved slowly, pausing every so often to look around. I kept the rifle trained on them as they drew closer, but I couldn't make out details until they were within 200 yards. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a torn jacket and carrying a backpack slung over one shoulder. He wasn't infected, at least not obviously. He moved with purpose, glancing over his shoulder as though afraid of being followed. I lowered the rifle slightly but didn't relax. He stopped halfway up the rise, scanning the ground where the pipe still lay. Then he turned directly toward the hatch, and I realized he'd seen me. He raised a hand slowly, palm out, in a universal sign of peace. "I know you're there," he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the empty air. "I'm not here to hurt you." I stayed silent, weighing my options. He could be alone, or he could be bait to lure me out, but I couldn't ignore the fact that he was the one who had tried to breach my door. "Please," he called again. "I just need water. I was trying to open it, yeah, but I wasn't going to hurt anyone. I didn't know if there was anyone left alive inside." I kept the rifle steady on him, my finger resting lightly on the trigger. The wind cut across the plain, stirring the dry grass at his feet, carrying his voice clearly down to where I crouched by the hatch. My mind was moving through every possibility, every trap this could be. If he had partners nearby, they could be waiting for me to expose myself fully. If he was infected, he might be hiding the early stages well. Trust was a luxury I couldn't afford anymore. "Stay where you are," I finally called back, my voice firm, louder than I meant it to be. He froze in place, his raised hand still hovering at shoulder height. "Don't take another step." "I'm not armed," he shouted, slowly lifting his jacket to show me his empty waistband. I just need water, please. I don't have much left, I lied, letting my tone harden. The system down here is barely working. If you leave now and don't come back, I'll give you a little. Enough to keep you going for a couple of days. But that's all I can do. He hesitated, shifting from one foot to the other. I could see the sunken hollows of his cheeks even from this distance. He looked like he hadn't eaten properly in weeks. I'm not asking for much, he said finally. I'll leave you alone. I just need something. You'll get it, I said, but you're going to tell me what's going on out here first. What you've seen, what you've heard, and you're going to stay exactly where you are while you do it. Understand? He nodded quickly, the movement jerky, almost desperate. Yeah, I understand. Then talk, I said. Start with how you found this place. His gaze flicked nervously to the horizon, then back to the hatch where I remained half hidden. I was following the old access road, he explained, speaking quickly now as though afraid I'd change my mind. I figured there had to be something out here. I saw the mound in the grass, the way the ground was shaped. It didn't look natural. Then I found the hatch. I didn't know if it was empty or not, but it was the only place I'd seen in miles that looked like it could be shelter. So, I tried to open it. I'm sorry. Who else is with you? I asked. No one, he said instantly. I've been alone for weeks. I didn't believe that entirely. His clothes were too clean for someone wandering the plains without backup, and his pack looked far too light to hold the supplies he'd need to survive. But pressing him harder now might spook him, and the last thing I wanted was him bolting without telling me what he knew. What about the infected? I asked. Have you seen any around here? His expression shifted, a shadow crossing his face. Yeah, he said, his voice dropping slightly. They're not like they were before, not slow anymore. They move faster now. They travel in groups, following roads and water. I barely got away from the last pack I ran into. How many? 7 or 8, maybe more, he said. I don't know. It was a week ago, maybe less. I stopped counting the days. The last place I saw anyone alive was a gas station near the highway. There were pieces left of the people who tried to hole up there. I didn't stick around. I let him speak, listening carefully to every detail. He described abandoned vehicles lining the roads, distant fires still smoldering in the ruins of farmhouses, and the sight of bodies, infected or not, lying half buried in the tall grass. It wasn't anything I hadn't expected, but hearing it confirmed how dangerous the surface had become. All right, I said finally. You've told me enough. Stay where you are and I'll bring up some water. If I see you move toward me, even an inch, you won't get a single drop. Do you understand? Yes, he said quickly. I'll stay right here. I slipped back down the ladder and grabbed a small container from my go bag, filling it from one of the backup canteens. When I returned to the hatch, I pushed the door open wider, just enough to step outside. The man was still standing in the same spot, eyes locked on the rifle slung across my chest. Set it on the ground and step back, I said, holding up the container. When I close the door, you can come get it, then you leave. He nodded again and did as he was told, stepping back several paces. I set the container down on the dry earth and started to retreat, keeping my rifle pointed low but ready. That was when I saw his expression change. His eyes widened, darting past me to the horizon. Behind you, he whispered, the words catching in his throat. I spun around instinctively, raising the rifle. In the distance, several figures were cresting the rise, moving quickly through the grass. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, heads snapping from side to side as if they were tracking something. The infected. Go! I shouted at the man, but he was already running, sprinting down the slope and vanishing into the grass without another word. He didn't even try for the water. I didn't blame him. I brought the rifle up and sighted on the closest infected. It had already locked onto me, its pale face twisting into a grotesque snarl as it broke into a loping run. I squeezed the trigger, the crack of the shot echoing across the empty land. The round took it high in the chest and it staggered but didn't go down. I fired again, adjusting my aim, and this time the body folded and skidded to a stop. The others were closer now. I fired a third shot, then a fourth, each one dropping another infected in turn. My hands worked mechanically, chambering rounds, sighting targets, pulling the trigger. The air was thick with the stench of rot by the time the last one fell face first into the dirt a mere 30 yards from the hatch. I pulled back through the hatch without looking at the bodies again. The heavy steel door slammed shut behind me with a reverberating clang that shook the frame. I engaged the hydraulic locks one by one, forcing the levers down with both hands, listening as the mechanisms latched into place. My pulse was hammering in my temples, but I stayed by the door for several minutes, rifle ready, ears straining for any sound. There was nothing, just the dim hum of the generator far below. I didn't sleep that night. I spent the next hour on the platform above the hatch, staring at the narrow viewing slit, wondering if more infected would appear. My mind kept circling back to the stranger, the way he'd bolted without hesitation the moment he saw them. I didn't know whether to be angry or relieved. He could have led them to me on purpose, or maybe he'd just been another desperate survivor unlucky enough to stumble onto this place. It didn't matter now. He was gone, and I was alone again. The next day, I busied myself with routine tasks, anything to keep my hands moving and my mind from drifting. I rechecked the motion sensors in the launch chamber, cleaned the rifle and restocked the magazines I'd emptied, and walked the entire perimeter of the silo more times than I could count. Each time I stopped at the blast door, staring at the gouges etched into the frame. They seemed deeper now, though I told myself I was imagining it. I leaned close and inhaled, but the steel smelled only of dust and rust. Whatever had been outside was gone. 2 days passed like that. I slept in short, uneasy bursts, waking to every creak and shift of the structure. I didn't dare surface right away. If someone had seen me the other day, they could be waiting for me to get careless. But eventually my curiosity got the better of me. I couldn't stay buried forever, not knowing whether my presence here had been discovered. On the third morning, I strapped on my pack and rifle and climbed the ladder to the hatch. I listened for a long moment before disengaging the first hydraulic lock. The air above was still. When I finally cracked the hatch, a rush of cool wind swept down into the silo. I stepped out cautiously, sweeping the rifle in an arc, scanning the surrounding plains. Everything looked normal. The dry grass stirred softly in the breeze, the horizon empty in all directions. I walked the perimeter slowly, pausing at every rise and dip in the ground. The bodies from the other day were gone. Drag marks led off into the grass, the kind I'd seen too many times before. Infected scavenging their own, or something else hauling them away. I crouched to examine the tracks, but they disappeared in the hard-packed soil a few yards out. I stood for a long time on the rise overlooking the old access road, staring at the line where the asphalt disappeared into the distance. I half expected to see a figure appear on the horizon, but the road was silent and empty. Whoever had been here before hadn't returned, at least not yet. I returned underground and sealed the hatch behind me, but I couldn't shake the unease. Every sound inside the silo seemed amplified now. Every hum of machinery, a reminder that this place was only as strong as the steel that separated me from the outside world. That night, I double-checked every door and slept with the rifle leaning against my cot, ready to be in my hands at a moment's notice. Another day passed uneventfully. I fell back into my routines, though I kept my ears open for any sign of intrusion. By evening, I had almost convinced myself that maybe the stranger had truly been alone, that he'd wandered on, and the danger had passed. I made a small fireless meal and sat in the control room to eat it, listening to the low whir of the ventilation system and the faint tick of the clock on the wall. Then came the explosions. The first blast shook the entire silo, rattling dust from the ceiling seams and sending my half-finished meal sliding off the table. I was on my feet instantly, rifle in hand, my ears ringing. The sound came from above, directly over the blast door. I could hear the deep metallic groan of the frame under pressure. Another explosion followed, louder this time, a concussive thud that reverberated down through the concrete walls. I staggered back against the far wall, my eyes darting to the cameras, but the surface feeds were still nothing but static. I ran for the ladder, climbing to the upper platform, my hands slick with sweat on the rungs. A third blast struck as I reached the top, the sound like a giant hammer slamming into the earth itself. I felt the blast door shudder beneath my boots, the hydraulic lock straining as the hinges screamed in protest. Dust poured down from the ceiling in thick clouds. I crouched low, bracing myself against the wall as the air filled with the metallic groan of bending steel. I barely had time to register what was happening before the fourth blow hit. The force of it sent a shudder through the entire structure. Then, with a sound that made my stomach drop, the blast door gave way. The hinges tore free of the concrete frame, and the massive slab of steel crashed down onto the platform, sending a gust of stale air surging through the shaft. I scrambled back, heart pounding as the echo of the impact faded. The entrance to my sanctuary, the single barrier that had kept me safe for 60 days, was gone. Through the cloud of dust rising from the fallen door, I could see the shaft leading up to the surface, now open to the dark sky above. Something moved at the edge of the hatch, silhouetted against the faint light. I raised the rifle without thinking and fired, the muzzle flash blinding me for an instant in the darkness. The figure jerked backward and vanished from sight. Another shape appeared in its place and I fired again. Then again, the shots ringing like thunder through the narrow shaft. The second man collapsed across the edge of the hatch, legs kicking briefly before sliding out of view. But there were more of them. I could hear the thud of boots on the concrete lip of the opening, the clatter of gear, voices shouting orders I couldn't quite make out. Then came the crack of return fire, bullets slamming into the steel platform around me, ricocheting off the railings with sharp metallic screams. I threw myself flat and crawled backward toward the ladder, barely managing to keep hold of the rifle as rounds tore through the air above me. The dust in the shaft grew thicker as more debris was kicked loose. I could see the faint outlines of men descending, weapons pointed downward, careful and methodical. There were at least 10 of them, maybe more. Whoever they weren't just scavengers. They were trained, moving with practiced coordination. I took a deep breath and lined up the sights on the first man dropping into view. The rifle cracked, the recoil slamming against my shoulder, and he twisted violently on the rope, tumbling into the darkness below. The man behind him tried to swing to the wall for cover, but I fired again, and his body jerked sideways, the rope slipping from his grip. He plummeted out of sight, his scream echoing up the shaft. The return fire was immediate. Bullets chewed into the concrete around me, sending shards of stone cutting into my arms and face. One round clipped the railing inches from my head. I ducked low and backed toward the stairwell that led down into the command center, my rifle spitting a few last suppressive shots as I retreated. By the time I reached the bottom of the stairs, they were already inside. The sound of boots striking metal rungs echoed through the shaft, shouts growing louder, more confident. I sprinted into the control room, slammed the door behind me, and threw the heavy bar lock into place. Then I doused the lights and crouched in the corner, forcing myself to stay absolutely still as the first of the intruders reached the platform above. The hours that followed were some of the longest of my life. I could hear them moving through the silo, boots scraping against the concrete floors, doors opening and slamming shut as they swept each section in turn. Occasionally one of them would call out to the others, their voices low, too distant for me to make out words. I could picture them spreading out, rifles raised, methodically checking every room and corridor. I had managed to kill at least 4 of them at the entrance, maybe more, but there were still too many left. 10, 12. I couldn't be sure. All I knew was that staying here meant eventually being cornered. My hands trembled as I gripped the rifle, ears straining for any hint that they were close. At one point, a beam of light swept across the small window in the control room door. I froze, holding my breath, afraid even the sound of my heartbeat would give me away. The intruder lingered for what felt like an eternity before moving on. I waited until the sound of his footsteps faded before allowing myself the smallest exhale. I couldn't hold out here forever. They were tearing the bunker apart piece by piece, and sooner or later they would reach this room. The thought of dying trapped in this concrete box was unbearable. If I wanted to live, I had to escape. I crouched in the dark and forced myself to think clearly. The main entrance was out of the question. Even if I made it past the men searching the lower levels, the shaft was now a death trap, completely exposed. I needed another way out. My mind went to the maintenance tunnels that fed the ventilation and water systems. Narrow, filthy, and half-collapsed in places, but they connected to surface vents more than 100 yards from the main hatch. If I could reach one of those vents, I might be able to slip out unseen. I moved silently to the storage shelves and dug out my go bag. I stuffed it with as much as I could carry: ammunition, water, rations, medical supplies, a flashlight, batteries, rope. I took only what I knew I would need, forcing myself to ignore the rest. Life was more valuable than this bunker, I reminded myself. Everything I'd built here, everything I'd sacrificed to prepare for this exact scenario. It no longer mattered if it meant I didn't survive the night. The sounds of the search were growing closer now. I could hear voices on the stairs, the metallic creak of the upper platforms as men crossed from one section to another. My time was running out. I crept to the back of the control room and pushed aside a metal panel that covered the maintenance shaft. The opening was barely wide enough for me to fit through. I slid the rifle in first, then lowered myself onto my stomach and began to crawl. The darkness swallowed me immediately, the concrete walls pressing tight on either side. My elbows scraped the rough floor as I inched forward, each movement sending a soft rustle through the dust and debris. I stopped when I heard the door to the control room splinter behind me. Shouts filled the air, boots pounding across the floor I had just vacated. Someone yanked the bar lock free and stormed inside, their flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. I lay perfectly still, pressed flat against the floor of the shaft, listening as they tore the room apart in search of me. Minutes passed before they left, their voices fading down the corridor. I exhaled slowly, the breath shuddering out of me, then began crawling again. The shaft twisted and dipped, forcing me to maneuver awkwardly, the weight of the go bag dragging against the walls. At one point, I thought I heard something moving behind me, but when I stopped to listen, there was only the faint hiss of air through the ducts. The crawl seemed endless. My shoulders ached from the effort, and my knees were raw from scraping against the concrete. But eventually I reached the junction where the tunnel split, one path leading to the water intake vent, the other to the surface ventilation shaft. I chose the ventilation shaft. It was the longer route, but the vent cover was higher off the ground, less likely to be watched. As I dragged myself forward, I could still hear the faint echoes of the intruders in the silo behind me. They hadn't realized yet that I'd slipped into the maintenance tunnels, but it was only a matter of time. I quickened my pace, ignoring the pain in my arms and legs, focusing only on the thin hope of freedom ahead. When I finally saw the faint sliver of moonlight filtering through the grate, relief almost overwhelmed me. I reached it and pressed my ear against the metal, listening. The night was quiet. No voices, no footsteps, only the wind whispering across the plains. I unstrapped the pry bar from my pack and worked it into the seam of the grate, levering it free inch by inch until it came loose with a soft groan. I slipped out into the tall grass, crouching low, my eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The bunker loomed in the distance behind me, its main hatch now a gaping hole where the blast door had once been. The thought of everything I was leaving behind hit me like a physical weight, but I forced it aside. The bunker had kept me alive for 60 days, but it had become a trap. I tightened the straps of my pack and slipped deeper into the grass, moving quickly but carefully, putting as much distance between myself and the silo as I could. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay. I didn't stop moving until the bunker was little more than a shadow behind me. I stayed low, slipping through the waist-high grass as the cold night wind whipped across the plains. I didn't know where I was going, but stopping meant giving the men inside a chance to catch up. My legs ached, my shoulders burned from the weight of the pack, but I pushed forward until my body demanded rest. By the time the first light of dawn spread across the horizon, I'd reached the remnants of an abandoned farmhouse. Its walls had partially collapsed. The roof caved in on one side, but the barn was still standing. I crept inside and found a dry corner behind a rusted tractor, hidden from view. I sat down with my back against the cold steel and let the fatigue wash over me, but I didn't allow myself to sleep. I just sat there, listening, scanning the empty fields through the slats in the barn walls for any sign of movement. I stayed there most of the day, rationing sips of water and a few bites of food while I listened for engines or voices that never came. When the sun began to set, I decided to move again. The barn was too exposed, too easy to find. I waited until full dark before slipping back into the fields, heading north toward the tree line I'd spotted in the distance earlier. It was close to midnight when I reached the woods. The trees closed around me like a shroud, their thick canopy blotting out what little moonlight there was. I moved carefully, one step at a time, testing the ground ahead with each footfall. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the distant rustle of leaves. That was when I first heard them. It was faint at first, a wet dragging sound somewhere ahead of me. I froze, my hand tightening on the rifle's grip, listening. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by a low gurgling moan that made my stomach twist. I crouched low and edged forward until I could see the source. A clearing opened ahead, bathed in thin moonlight. In the center were 3 infected, but they weren't moving like the others I'd seen. They weren't even standing. Their bodies were twisted and broken, sprawled on the forest floor as though they'd collapsed mid-stride. One of them lifted its head weakly when it heard me, jaw snapping at the air, but its limbs refused to obey. Another tried to crawl forward and failed, dragging itself in a slow circle as its ruined legs twitched uselessly behind it. I stepped into the clearing cautiously, my rifle aimed at their heads. They made no attempt to get up. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched thin over jutting bones. I'd seen infected before, but never like this. It was as though something had drained them, left them too weak to move. I circled wide around them, watching the way their empty eyes followed me, and a cold certainty settled in my gut. Whatever had done this to them, it wasn't mercy. I didn't linger. I slipped back into the trees and kept moving. The image of those paralyzed infected burned into my mind. I didn't know if they were sick, starving, or something worse, but it felt like a warning. I reached a small ravine with a shallow creek running through it. The banks were steep enough to offer some cover, and I found a narrow overhang where the roots of a fallen tree had carved out a dry pocket in the earth. It wasn't much, but it would keep me hidden. I cleared out the debris, laid my pack on the dirt as a pillow, and tried to settle in. I couldn't sleep. Every sound in the woods felt magnified. The distant creak of trees, the trickle of water in the creek, the occasional rustle of something moving in the brush. My mind kept drifting back to the bunker, to the invaders tearing through my sanctuary, and the infected crawling helplessly in the clearing. There was no safety left anywhere. At some point in the long hours before dawn, I realized I was stepping into a void. Everything I had relied on was gone now. The walls, the stockpiles, the routines that had kept me alive for 60 days. Out here, there was nothing but open ground, and the possibility of death waiting behind every shadow. But I was still alive. That had to be enough for now. I closed my eyes, clutching the rifle tight against my chest, and told myself that when morning came, I would keep moving, because staying still in this world was just another way of dying. That's all for now. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more unsettling creepypastas. Your support keeps my channel alive. Until next time, stay quiet, stay vigilant, and trust nothing, not even the silence.